Indeed it
This is our
has.
first time this year, is it not?
It is,
It is.
as they say. Yes, it is our first time together. Um, so what are we on the verge of? What do you think?
Oh,
Well, if we're looking for folks to go first, I'm happy to volunteer myself.
come on, Steve.
In the good news, bad news world, I am, as both of you know, been trudging along, being hunted and stalked by a wild animal called The Beautiful Business, which is a book that will come out in 2021. And the reason I say being stalked by wild animals, because I really do feel like this book has been over my shoulder, speaking, sometimes whispering, but sometimes kind of stalking me through my consciousness and subconscious over the last couple of years. And so I'm on the verge of putting that book out into the world. And that is the good news. The good news part of that is that the book manuscript is done, complete, off for editing, and it's going to be checked for typos. And I'm bringing early readers into it to get feedback and whatnot. And one of the early reader comments thus far, and I was sort of blown away by this, was that it is the artist's way for business leaders. So while
Nice.
I don't certainly subscribe to the weight of Julia Cameron's seminal book, I do hope that it does have that kind of impact. However, there's bad news. I thought the book was going to come out this spring as spring and our world would be flourishing and full of beauty and flowers and whatnot. Unfortunately, thanks to COVID and all the things that are associated with that, I think the book's not going to come out until September timeframe. And but I am trusting the divine order of things and how I can now have a longer runway to help plant the seeds and prepare this book for world readiness. So that's what I'm on the verge of at this
You're
point.
on the verge. Well, I think there's lots of good things to celebrate in that. I mean, one is being hunted by the wild animal of your own artistry. Like, we could just talk about that now for the next 15 minutes, frankly. And congratulations on finishing that book. And personally, I think September is a great month because that's the harvest month. That's a great metaphor for your book, is that it will be the time that you harvest all of that work, all of that creativity, all of that time, that you were hunted.
Running naked through the woods as the book and the words and the ideas were chasing me down.
Away from my snake, right? We were just
Oh
talking
my
about
goodness.
the wild
So it's a
animal.
wild snake. Has the book changed much, Steve, since you first started to conceive of it? Has it evolved over time?
Yes, I would say quite a bit. I think my thinking around the book itself, The Beautiful Business, what it means to me, what it means to the world, what it means to the folks that are in my orbit and audience. And I think the two biggest metaphors that come out of the book are really and these are sort of interchangeable, and they can be fertile ground for the conversation around artistry. One of which is as the business leader thinks about their business as a work of art, they can, drift very quickly into the consideration that they are an artist and an artist in the world of business, and that can obviously mean lots of different things. And it's a very simple definition. An artist is one who creates things that are intended to move people. So an artist, as we know in the circle of artistry, a big part of the process around that is putting your work out into the world. So in the world of business, those business leaders step immediately into their industry and they're into the commerce, and they're looking to reach an audience and move the audience and create value. So that's one big metaphor that comes out of the book. And the other side of it, which Libby, this goes back a little bit to your point, which is the fall being the time of harvest, is that the business leader can see themselves as a gardener. as one who is nurturing, tending, growing, and having a flourishing garden that they can harvest and take part in the beauty and things that are associated with the laws and the rules of nature, and working with the elements that surround that particular garden, much of which is not in our control. And so we don't get to control how much it rains or how much sunshine we get. We don't get to control, the world of COVID, or the way an animal might show up into that garden and, like a rabbit eating some of the most delicious vegetables. We don't get to control those things. So those are the two biggest metaphors. And I think as the book has changed, I've become more clear about what those metaphors actually mean and how they work in the world of business artistry and how they work in the world of business to help shape and even reshape what we call capitalism here today.
Well, I can't wait for this. I already told you that, like, it's going to be one of my Libby's book club books, and I will look very forward to that. And maybe in a little while you might read us a little passage or two if you feel like it. If you can dig around there in your files, maybe you can read a little passage or two. I mean, I think also what's interesting about what you just said in terms of the business leader, seeing themselves as an artist is, I think we're on the verge. Again, we keep it's like like a swelling and then a retreating, and a swelling and a retreating. I know you get that, the surfer that you are. But I feel like, we're still crying out in the business world, in organizational life, for those things that nourish us, that help us see things differently, that feel different than it's just a job. I've noticed that in the last year in my own work, and the way that people responded to what was happening. And the last time we did a live, we were talking about like using the metaphors of the messages of COVID. You guys remember that?
Yeah.
Sure. Social distancing, and I can't remember what else was it, Owen? I can't remember. But anyway,
washing hands.
Right. We just talked about the metaphors of that, and I know my clients have been willing to look at themselves differently, to talk about things differently, and I think emerging new businesses and new ideas, we're on the verge of that, and I also think I would say, like, so I'm on the verge of my emerging memoir that has been. Yeah. I'm gonna have to think about this as being like hunted by an animal, because it certainly feels like that. But the animal is like inside me, so that's a whole different like relationship. But it also goes back to that idea of muse, and that idea of the creative impulse, the desire to cross over, to speak out, to find a voice. We have all kinds of examples of those voices. I loved the enthusiasm for Amanda Gorman's poem, and it's funny, as a poet, hearing people get excited about poetry as if it's the first time they ever heard it, and so like I have both like the excitement of celebrating just how absolutely perfect that was, how poised and brave and moving, that woman in the yellow, the yellow outfit, reading her poem, on the steps there. Like it was inspiring for so many people. And then it's like, okay, yeah, poetry is like the oldest art form in the world, cave painting. But anyway, I'm so excited about that, because I do feel like we're on the verge of art and artistry taking its next full place in the collective consciousness, which is not separate from or alien to the business conversation. That's my hope.
It's really interesting, Libby, too, that and you know this better than I do, that the tradition of the poets is not only goes back for eons, but they also they were the truth speaker both to the public and in the ears of the leaders, and they were in ancient times treated as the most trusted advisor that a king or queen or type of monarch might actually have. And I found the Amanda Gorman's reclamation of that truth speaking in her beautiful, flowery, powerful innocence. I really saw her performance and her presence as this beautiful flower being offered in a context of political chaos, and knowing that just 10 days before that, all kinds of things had happened at that very particular moment. And it was almost as if we as humanity were placing a flower at the point of this particular area that didn't have flowering ability whatsoever.
Yeah, those ancient poets, the truth tellers, were also the first ones to get their heads cut off. But anyway, that might be a good transition to Owen, who knows all about all those wild and ancient ways. So anyway, yeah, no, she was incredible. So Owen, what are you on the verge of, or what's speaking to you in this conversation about
so much. I think you're right, Steve. That old idea of the poet too was also the keeper of wisdom, of memory, and of history too. Mm. So that idea that we can be trapped in this, in all of the emergencies of our present life, but the poet is able to say, there's nothing. This has all happened before, by the way, and regardless of what your individual experience is, here's a piece that someone else has experienced the exact same thing that you're going through. Mm-hmm. So there's certainly a great intensity of our time that doesn't seem to be going away right now with all of the COVID pandemic and the restrictions around us. So the year ahead doesn't look to be shaping up to be much more open for travel and things as perhaps we'd hoped. So one thing I see is a test of endurance, actually, people's endurance being tested. And I see a change of generation too. So we've seen in so many companies, older CEOs retiring and stepping back, and a younger generation taking over, because of course a younger person can endure more hardship than someone older. And there's an interesting thing too, that we're only really sent the challenges that we can endure. And so if you are going through something, well, this is the time to be able to, how are you going to deal with it, So I think that there's an extraordinary challenge for us to ask ourselves, and not just generation as metaphor too. So what is the next part of ourselves actually that's being asked to step up, or being asked to emerge right now, through hardship and through toughness. So I've found that, it's very interesting. I have some great coaching clients who are leaders in their field, and they're being heaped with more and more responsibility, which they can endure, and they feel able for it. And they feel able to say to those who aren't able to endure it, no problem, listen, you can step aside. Actually, myself and others, we're able to deal with this, and it's not always going to be like this too. So I see great leadership. Yeah.
Do you see any of your corporate clients joining in the great conversation of the hedge school? Maybe I'm assuming not everyone knows about that, but that's one thing I'm seeing is leaders being willing to kind of like go into the corners of their ideas about creativity and entrepreneurship and innovation in a way. So I'm just curious if, like, are you seeing that happening?
I think there is a generational shift that people like our great friend David White, or the great pioneers of progressive organizational management like Peter Block, and people bringing ideas of, or the organic metaphor into organizational management, as opposed to the mechanistic industrial metaphor perfected by the Japanese model, And but there's which is necessary when you want to build as many cars as possible, as perfectly as possible. But the other side of the organization is that when you're working with people, it's much more of a garden. It's much more of a blank canvas rather than a machine. So I think that there's a next generation again too that's actually very aware of the subtleties and complexities of the garden of an organization. And so I think that there is this generational shift, and I think there will be a greater sense of the complexity, the organic nature of organizational management. So I think that definitely the Generation X, the Gen X are much more comfortable, not more comfortable, but aware of the complexity of organic systems. So art and metaphor are essential when you're trying to play with these systems. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's so interesting to hear you both talk about this in organizational life. I'll tell you a quick story. I just got an invitation from somebody who's on my reading list who I don't know, and the invitation came across from this business leader on the East Coast, and it started off as well, Steve, I've been reading your writing for some time, and I resound with so much of it, but I really don't know what to do with you. Well,
I've been wondering
well,
that.
at first I felt really bad because I haven't done a good job of articulating what I can do for the world. So maybe I need to step up into that. But as we got deeper into a conversation, I realized where the difficulty came from. And it really had to do with kind of what we're talking about here now, which is how the business leader is looking very differently at their world, mostly internal, at least with this particular perspective, and how this particular organization and this leader can treat his team from a nurturing perspective. And so it is not about productivity. Like, the cultural work that I do often is about, either brand work or organizing a culture so that they can get along better and be more engaged in the work so that ultimately they can be more productive. And he said to me, I am not at all interested in that. We're very productive. I want to nurture my people. And I want to figure out a way to work with you so we can work on the wholeness of who they are as they show up in the work. Because the old adage of, check yourself at the door or leave your ego at home and don't bring your whole self to work. Anyone who's sort of been invited in that particular context knows that that is an impossibility, and B, it's a myth that existed. But then we get immediately into the paradox of those things, which is, how does one go about bringing their whole self to work, their own unique genius, and apply it into a system of community that we call organizational culture, so that both they and the whole thrives and flourishes, and we all get to feed off of it, and it regenerates itself. The idea of these paradoxes are quite difficult, but we also understand that the human condition is a paradox to begin with. On one side, we're these primal creatures that are, connected to the natural world around us, and our animalistic qualities. We're about to have a full moon right now, and so my sleep patterns are crazy off the Richter scale, and I'll get very little sleep over the next couple of days. But the other side of it is that we're these spiritually animated humans that are just like all other living things, conscious of the unseen forces that animate us, and we pull those things into our everyday lives. And I think it's particularly difficult to do and complex to do in the work environment, which is why I think the advocation and even the metaphorical perspective of artistry comes deeply into play into that particular realm.
Yeah, I love what you're saying, and I think, and I want to go back to something Owen said too, because I like this idea of like being on the verge of generational shift, whether it's a literal generation or the generational shift inside us. And I mean, one of the things I think about, like the notion of honoring the whole person at work. I mean, I think we've had fits and starts to try to do that, like nap pods or food on campus, or like things like that, right? And certainly like another nod to David, right? Because David was one of the first people who said it's completely unfair to imagine that they could leave part of themselves out in the parking lot. But I have to say, like, so a lot of the work I do is around like conversation, communication, influencing, etc. And I've been working on programs in the last couple of years, ironically called Leading Through Times of Change. When it was developed, it was not meant for what we went through last year, although it was absolutely applicable. But it was so interesting. The other day, I got a note from a man who had been through one of our online classes, and he said, I've lived in the same house, been married to the same woman, and had the same job for 39 years. And I'm so excited to try some of these tools and ideas that you shared. And I was like, okay, I'm going to call that a win. because I think that sometimes we imagine that we might not be able to reinvent or go to the next generation of ourselves creatively or in our work or anything like that. And I was just I think that's the most hopeful, affirming, kind of statement that I could get myself for. Keep going. And that goes back to Owen's, notion about endurance, right? Like, keep going.
Absolutely.
And so, yeah, I guess that's what I would say to like each of you and us, like keep going.
Yeah.
And how then, there's that famous story as well too that David often talks about when brother David Stendelross said to David that exhaustion is the antidote to exhaustion isn't rest, it's wholeheartedness. And again, the mechanistic model would say, well, if the system's starting to dwindle in production, you just hump more coal on the fire. It's easy. You just, but that's not possible with the human person actually, because you can burn yourself out. You can literally be burnt out, which I'm sure many people have had the experience of. You just work harder, put in more hours. It doesn't necessarily work. You have to go deeper into the heart. And it's the poets. Yeah, I've been quoting William Butler Yeats, who is Ireland's national poet. And of course, like all poets, he wasn't a poet at all. He was a statesman and a revolutionary and an insurgent. And he was chanting into place a whole new national identity that was in counterculture to the British Empire at the time, the greatest empire the world had ever seen. And William Butler Yeats was standing up on the metaphorical, almost the literal barricades, chanting a new nation into life in the face of insurmountable odds that were just about to crush any type of insurrection in the form of the British Empire. So you're talking about extraordinary courage that the poet's identity brings. The poet is able to stand up to insurmountable odds and yet be able to, I suppose, have no fear, have that courage from the heart as well too. And Yeats has that great poem, The Lake Isle of Innisfree, which I think is the metaphor of the place that we have to go to in order to well the energy of the heart. And the last lines, he says, I will arise and go now, for always night and day I hear lake water lapping in low sounds by the shores. When I stand on the roadway or on the pavements grey, I hear it in the deep heart's core. So Yeats he's showing us, he's telling us, look, when you're on the roadway or on the pavements grey, when you're in times of endurance, you can just flick this little switch here and you can hear the lake water lapping. And that is where your deep heart's core. It's interesting, he uses the sense of listening too, the importance of listening and receptivity and openness and calm and mindfulness, all of these tools that are so important for us to keep going.
That's a beautiful way to round out our conversation. Honestly, do you know the whole poem?
I do. Yeah, it's great. This is one of Yeats's most famous, and everyone in Ireland at least has a verse of it. It's just 3 verses, and it's just beautiful. And there's recordings of Yeats actually reciting it himself. Old recordings from the early 1900s.
Yeah,
and Yeats was also a deeply mystical, spiritual man. and he was involved in all sorts of esoteric Freemasonry and stuff. And he really believed that the right sounds said the right way would actually bring into being a certain type of magic, actually. And so you can hear him, and he sounds very spooky the way he recites it. It's really spooky. And he would say this is how he would actually write poetry. It would come out in just ha, and ha, and slowly the words would form and take shape. And so you'll hear that in this, and he's going to this metaphorical island, this special place, which is where we can all draw from a deeper source of power. Yeah. So he says, I will arise and go now, and go to Inish free, and a small cabin build there of clay and wattles made. 9 bean rows will I have there, and a hive for the honey bee, and live alone in the bee loud glade. And I shall have some peace there, for peace comes dropping slow, slow, like the veils of the morning to where the cricket sings. There midnight's all a glimmer, and noon a purple glow, and evening full of the linnet's wings. I will arise and go now, for always, night and day, I hear lake water lapping in low sounds by the shores. When I stand on the roadway or on the pavement's grey, I hear it in the deep heart's core.
Beautiful.
Bravo, bravo.
I'm so
Bravo.
looking forward to the day when we get to regather around a table and do just that with each other, Owen. Thank you for invoking that.
Great, thank you. And yeah, Steve, do you have a little excerpt you'd like to read for us?
Yeah, let me pull up a paragraph or two in my beautiful business. There's this. It's the last piece that I ended up writing for the beautiful business, and it's the prelude. And I'll just read the first paragraph or so. So it begins. One of the things that I've learned about being in business is that there is no hard and fast rules. There are no must-dos other than to survive, and even that's mostly a choice. Much of what business schools, business leaders, and business books teach us is cut from the fabric of experiences that come through the trials and errors of doing business. Of course, there are loads of historical data harvested from successful and unsuccessful businesses that can and should be studied and learned from. But how one great company realized success, or how some failed, excuse me, is not necessarily the right approach for your business, and it's no guarantee of success or failure. Just because another company succeeds or fails doesn't define your path to the success or even your fulfillment. Life and business are a grand experiment, an open canvas, a blank page, an empty vessel for you to fill with your passions, drivers, desires, and dreams. It's all a journey into the abyss of what's possible.
Beautiful, yeah.
Now that's provocative. We want to read that book.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's lovely, Steve. Really great.
It's fantastic. I know. I wish I could reach out and take the book now, Steve. So
soon enough. Yeah.
Build anticipation for this book. Yeah. I think it's so interesting too, because I have a coaching client I've worked with for many years now, but I've worked with their organization, and but a couple of years ago we began working together in earnest one-on-one, and a lot of times I ask people to get clear on certain things just around intentions, and and she chose beauty, and honestly, like that's like totally cool in our little circle here. She was the first CEO that I, with whom I'd worked who said they wanted to choose something like that. She's, in a field, she's not in an artistic field at all.
Yeah.
Not field at all. And so, like part of what that's invoking for me right now, but listening to both of you is that, you know, one of the ways that we can foster, notice, experience wholeheartedness, I think, is our experience with beauty. You know, whether we're holding it at our deep heart's core, or we're imagining our own pathway through something that you know has a long affair with the mechanistic mind, and why that's not completely. I'm not going to go down that metaphor street, but it's a good one. The affair with the mechanistic mind, you know, totally unsatisfying, by the way. Anyway.
Yeah, and it, you know, it to me, it begins to feel like, well, two things relevant here. First and foremost, that, you know, beauty in its deeper meaning sense, the felt sense, the experiential sense, and what Maslow called the moments of awe, really is, it feels like it's drifting into the zeitgeist of society. And perhaps because, the second point, it is a remedy, it's an antidote to the mechanistic, the highly strategic, and even the easily disrupted mind. In order for one to experience beauty, you have to have a certain amount of presence there in order for that felt sense to come through and for you to be affected by it. You cannot find it scrolling through the pages of, you know, Instagram or whatever the latest social media feed might be, and certainly you won't find it in the pages of, you know, Wall Street Journal. But by pausing with presence, there is we suspend the busyness, the disease of busyness within our society, and then we can allow, or at least put ourselves in the way of beauty, and allow ourselves to be moved by it.
Yeah, I find for me it's holding the coexistence of opposites, because there's part of what I desire is to be in that bee glade glen and not be listening to anyone else, and certainly not to be where we are right now, like, you know, live broadcasting on a social media platform, which is what, you know, how we're getting to share with each other, right? So how could I hate that, but then at the same time hate that? And I do think, you know, that's an ultimate poet's question too, about, you know, what we create, what's valued, what we pay for. And I know that's, I'm taking us down a whole other road, but I do, maybe it is about like what we value, you know, what we value, what we think is important, what we show up for, what we notice. And what I'm hoping is that, you know, we are on the verge of noticing ourselves in the world and in relationship to each other in a really different way. And, you know, whether that's a generational shift and it's time for some of us to step aside and let other people have the podium, which is entirely possible, or whether it's about like reigniting a new generation in ourselves. I love that idea. I'm gonna use that one.
Will you give us a poem, Libby? Maybe to.
Well, I tell you what. How about a short excerpt from the memoir?
That would be fantastic. Yeah.
Yes, yes.
This is a, like, it's not even typed yet, right? So it's still in here. But I think it might be appropriate for where we are. Anyway, it's called Minestrone. It's a section, okay? And anybody who's read my poems know I'm always writing about cooking and gardening and whatever, as, you know, great metaphors for other things. But anyway, this will give you a glimpse into where I'm on the verge. Minestrone. In March, when the first unbelievable order to lockdown began, I spent outrageous amounts on food. I'm not sure I really believed in a food shortage, as zealots predicted, but I wasn't sure what else to do. This was in the quiet time, the time between the already ramped up 2020 and the flight back from Dallas on March 6th, and my calendar emptying out only a few days later. This was right before a thoughtful client sending me a cancellation notice wrote, "It's going to be okay," in the subject line, before he prophetically offered to extend my contract for a year. This was before I began walking new routes in my neighborhood, discovering Wally, the speckled pig, only a few blocks from my house, and before the day before, where a woman I don't know paused her gardening to look up at me and say, "Hello," abandoning the cool Seattle way we barely acknowledge each other. And she said, "It's nice to see someone's whole face and look them in the eye." In truth, I've had the Georgi Sisters cookbook for over 3 years. I'd pick it up every so often and thumb through, but not stop. I'd reread the introduction written by my father in 1987, and then I'd close the pages over the crackly plastic spine and put it back on the antique oak desk. I never made one thing. But finally, it seemed time to sit quietly with the pages gathered and collected by my great aunts, Yelva and Vienna, and my grandmother Lola, and decide which recipe would take the prestigious place of the first one. It was March in Seattle, which feels a bit like December or January, wet, gray, 40 degrees. You have to look closely at a bare branch to see its potential, its cyclical belief that life after something like winter is infinitely possible.
Beautiful, beautiful.
Yeah, so
You know,
it's a piece about making that soup from an ancestral cookbook. So
yeah. Yeah, and it brings up the concept, or perhaps even the reminder of wintering. And I feel like the COVID shutdown, we've been so sequestered off from public places. You know, we've been in this long, extended wintering process. And going back to Amanda Gorman, I think part of the reason, perhaps subconscious, or maybe conscious, is her presentation, her poem, and her performance of that poem felt like we were coming out of this wintering, sequestered, hold off type of world into this being on the verge of, coming out into a world that has perhaps different coloration to it, a different tonality or different tonal quality to it. And Libby, your words there, I love the sentiment of the woman who lifted her head from the garden just to see someone's full face and the human expression behind that. I think it's something that I yearn for as well in public spaces. We have this wonderful thing called people watching. It's hard to people watch these days.
Watch the past, yeah. So, oh my goodness, it's been so good to be here with you all today.
Good.
And
thank you, guys. Yeah.
And we'll look forward to another studio gathering soon, I hope.
For sure.
Yeah. Owen, do you want to bring us home with a tune or a little ditty?
What do we do? Yeah.
Little something.
I'll
A few
give it
bars.
This is a nice little English folk song I'm working on at the moment, and it yes, it's about love that has been outlawed, but the woman persists and says that
As she
despite cursing her lover, she's going to actually in the end wait it out. She's going to wait it out. So there was a lord lived in this town who had a handsome, lovely daughter. She was courted by a fair young man who was a servant to her father. And when her parents came to know, they swore they'd send him from the island. The maid she knew her heart would break had she to part with young Matt Highland. And then straightway into her love she goes, into his room him to awaken, saying, "Rise, my love, and go away. This very night you will be taken." I overheard parents say that in spite of me they will transport you. So rise and go away. I wish to God that I'd gone before you. They both sat down upon the bed, just for the sight of 1/2 hour, and not a word between them said, but down their cheeks the tears did shower. She placed her hand around his neck, and on his breast her arms entwined. No duke nor lord nor earl I'll wed, but I'll wait for thee, my own Matt Highland, my own Matt Highland.
Oh yeah, beautiful, beautiful.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks to both
Thanks,
of you.
guys.
Anyone who felt like listening to us today, it's so fun always fun to riff and improv with the two of you. So
great.
Looking forward to being on more of those beautiful conversations and journeys with you. So
okay, talk to you soon, guys. Bye, Steve.
Always so
Bye,
beautiful,
Libby.
guys. Let's do this again sometime soon.
Great.
All right.
And we're off.